So, hi everyone. I'm here with Steve Morrell today, who's the managing director of Contact Babel. And Steve, we just wanted to go through. You just released a new survey around exceeding customer expectations, and I know there's some really interesting data in it. So, I know that we wanted to chat a little bit just to run through some of that data and what that kind of means for the contact industry, but then also, from my point of view, for the collections industry as well, because I think there's some dynamite stuff in there.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you very much for inviting me. Yeah, we've just completed and launched Exceeding UK Customer Expectations 23 to 24, which is a survey of 1,000 UK customers, looking at what they want from businesses, what they're actually getting, and what they do about it.
So now I know you've got some information you wanted to share, and we're going to put some slides up. I would emphasise that we'll put a link in the post as well, just if people want to download the whole of the survey and see that. And I think you've got a new one coming out as well, so people are welcome to take part in that too as well. So we'll put the links down below. Steve, do you want to just put that up?
So this is our new report, as you can see, sponsored by Contexta 360, Enshows Interactive, Iris Clarity, NICE, and Sabio. So, looking firstly at kind of customer issues, what problems people most often say that they have when they're contacting the business. I think you can see there fairly obviously and not unexpectedly that the large majority of people fairly often or very often say that the queue time is too long. Having said that, it's probably worth looking at. It's not just a matter of get your queue times down and then everything's fine. As you can see there, the majority of people report these things happening more often than they'd want to in many cases. And even things like I can't hear clearly and have to repeat myself and things like that. It's not necessarily something you'd think is a particular bugbear. In fact, it is. And as you might imagine, particularly amongst the kind of older population. So it's not the case that we've just got to solve one issue here and everything else falls into place.
Yeah, I thought it was quite interesting that queue times still seem to be dominant from a consumer issue point of view. And interesting, like I'm only calling as I couldn't solve my issue online, and whether you've seen that sort of change over time, really, or what the kind of trends are really around that.
Yeah, as we'll see later, the queue time trends are very much going upwards. They went up drastically during the pandemic, as you might have expected, but they haven't come back down. In fact, they've leveled off at best. So it's still the case that people are kind of, contact centers are still suffering and customers are suffering with them. This kind of the online issue, yeah, we dug into that a bit more. And it not necessarily the case that the functionality wasn't there on the website. It was just that people either couldn't find it or weren't confident about it, or the functionality was there but didn't work properly. Again, it's not the case of, oh, we'll just pop everything on the website and everything's fine. People still have issues. And there is still, again, amongst the kind of older population in particular, the feeling that if you want something done properly, you need to talk to somebody. That's not going away.
It sounds like there's a lot more to do from a digital point of view. So probably, yes, it's improved because now at least you can actually find stuff online. But now we need to do more because there's still a bit of frustration around almost like the release valve is to then call in and then the normal dynamics apply.
Absolutely. We asked contact center managers what proportion of calls come from people who have already tried to solve their issue online, and it is a large minority, if that's the thing, 30 to 40%. So people, they are giving it a fair crack of the whip. They can't do it physically themselves, or it's simply not there.
The takeaway for me, certainly from a collections industry point of view, is obviously queue time, lost call rate, those kind of things are still critically important. Although we've had all this focus on digital, we still got to look after the things we're actually very familiar with, and that's really very relevant from an inbound point of view.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
We just mentioned something there. When we look at, because when another survey, we look at where customer experience budget is being spent, and it's probably about 60 to 70% digital, 20 to 30 phone, and the rest of it of the businesses that do stuff in store. So it's despite the fact that when you look at the proportion of interactions, as we'll see later, that those are almost flipped around. So you get far more phone calls than you do digital interactions. It's worth talking about. I have to call back multiple times and explain the issue again, because that's first contact resolution. And although you've got more than half the people said they've got a problem with that, as we found, is actually the key driver to customer experience and satisfaction. So it's well focusing on getting first contact resolution. So yeah, what we've done here, as you see, we've been around for a while, been tracking this since 2004, and the story there is very much kind of a gradual increase in speed to answer over the years, then shooting up during the pandemic years and staying up there. It'd be interesting to see when we do our survey at the end of this year whether those figures are coming down or not. And call abandonment rate, as you would expect logically, is linked to speed to answer. The longer you have to wait, the more likely you are to abandon a call, and that tracks it pretty closely.
This graph really shocked me from an inbound point of view, just how much it has gone up. And we all know that if we're all consumers essentially making calls in, and we know it feels like there's been longer wait times, which will then be linked to higher abandon rates as well. But do you think that just purely related to pandemic, and are we seeing that now, do you think, in terms of resourcing? So it's almost like we've bounced back from the pandemic, the volume has returned, but maybe there isn't the resource then to then bring that back down. But I was really surprised just how high it's gone, and it's continued to go up. And it's almost like businesses haven't reacted to bring people on to then fix it. And this is despite all the conversation around self-serve as well.
That's right. I think there's a few things coming into play here, I think, and some will be kind of more resonant with some businesses than others. The last few years have seen a lot of opportunity for alternative jobs. And if a contact center agent is being paid minimum wage, then to be honest, they could go on the tills at a supermarket and earn the same money, and it'd be a far easier job. So we have seen the attrition rates going up, and off the back of that, obviously recruitment is going to be more of an issue. So yes, the resourcing things there. As we'll talk about in a minute, we've seen the customer demand for the voice channel increasing over the pandemic and staying there. So these are all things that kind of put pressure on that channel. I've no doubt that these figures will start to come down, because they do look out of control at the moment. But I think as customers become increasingly happy to use digital channels, that will take some of the pressure off, and we are starting to see that now. But we have to realise that the phone is the kind of gold standard channel for customer contact. And during the pandemic, a lot of people were very emotional about a lot of things, and they got into the habit of using the phone again, and that hasn't really gone away yet.
I thought it was so interesting because it's different from necessarily the narrative that we're all in, the sort of the industry narrative, which has been around digitalization. Let's push digitalization. Let's push self-serve. Do you think we've almost sold ourselves the resourcing of the contact center doesn't really matter because we're investing in all this digital stuff and the self-serve stuff? When actually, if you actually look at the results, particularly over this longer term trend, it's almost like we've taken our eye off the ball and not resource the contact centers properly, because we pretended that it's gone away, but actually it really hasn't. And the data kind of says that. It was a real aha moment for me.
No, very true. What this boils down to is customer demand has not gone away from the phone channel. In fact, in the past couple of years, it has increased for the phone channel. And that's something we saw when we started tracking figures in terms of proportion of interactions in about 2006, 2007. Phone was about 90%. And it dropped very rapidly over those years, but it's bumped along between the 60 and 65% for many years now. So you're picking the low-hanging fruit with kind of self-service and digital. But I'd say the fact remains that we've not really asked the customer what they want to do. We've just said, right, here are new channels, go away and use them. And the customer's like, to be honest with you, a lot of the time, no, I don't want to do that. And as I said, the resourcing is going into digital. The investment rather is going into digital rather than the phone channel. With the results you can see there.
Yeah, it's just interesting. It just feels like there needs to be a much more like blended approach. And it's skewed some of my opinions or views to a certain extent. So it's very interesting.
There's another factor here as well, that the types of phone call that people are getting now tend to be more complex and take longer. You've also got more security in a lot of cases, which drags out the conversation. Call durations are going up as well. So obviously, if you get the same number of agents but longer calls, you're going to be able to take fewer of them.
Yeah.
So call duration for service and sales. And as you can see, it's climbed very significantly in the past 19 years. Is that looking at service calls have almost doubled in duration in that time. Sales calls get more complex. You've got probably compliance issues that you didn't have back in the day, reading people their terms and conditions and what have you. And also we've got cross-selling, upselling opportunities. We've got somebody on the phone, spend a bit longer with them and try and sell them some more stuff. So, the story with that is very clear, that call duration of whatever is going upwards.
Yeah, it's a very similar story in collections contact. Some of that's been driven via regulation as well. So, for example, affordability, income expenditure, etc. You'll see 10, 15 minutes, even up to 40-minute type of calls, depending on the products as well.
There's a couple of other factors that feed into this as well. On the face of it, the chart we showed before, the abandonment and the call duration, so the abandonment and the speed to answer going upwards, that's not good news for anybody, unequivocally. This doesn't necessarily say the same thing. It's not necessarily bad news, because I say going towards the left-hand side of that graph, the call duration was seen as quite a key metric then. Cost per call, it's very much keep it tight, get it through them, work on your call through. But now it's much less seen as a key metric, because a longer call can mean a greater relationship, building more cross-selling, upselling opportunities and stuff like that. So in itself, it's not necessarily seen as a bad thing. However, it's when you start digging into what's actually happening within that call, you can see that some of that fat can be trimmed. So you've got loads of time spent unnecessarily in ID&V, identity verification, which in terms of the proportion of the call, the length of ID&V has gone up a lot in the past few years as things get more complex and you greater number of fraud threats, so you have to react to those accordingly. So you're looking at probably 40 seconds there, which is of no benefit to anybody, but you've still got to do it. So there's ways to do that, to get around that. And you've also got complex calls will require longer post-call wrap-up. So the agent might be there writing notes on the call, maybe notes after the call and things like that. And again, there are ways in which we can reduce that, and AI comes into that. And the third thing is also, I think it's 97 or 98% of contact centers don't have a single pane of glass for their agents. So the agent's having to flick between applications, often can be 6-7 applications, some of them legacy, and that can take a long time as well. So that's a more dead time within the call. So although the content of the call is richer, there's still the case that we're wasting an awful lot of time within the figures you can see there that could be got rid of and not hurt the relationship and certainly improve the performance of the contact center.
Yeah. Yeah, the idea of AI and the post-call wrap-up, I think, is quite interesting in terms of like how can you use that to populate notes or to summarize calls or those kind of things. Have you seen that starting to roll out yet, or is that still early days?
It's starting to. Obviously, it's not a kind of either or. So, it might be used for some things and not for others, or fairly basic stuff, or make suggestions to the agent who then accepts it. Yes, that's what my understanding of the call was as well. And it's a kind of iterative process, really. There are some things. So, for example, if there's a change of address, but the address might be held over 6 or 7 databases, then, you can use RPA, robotic process automation, to kind of write those in the background to those databases without the agent having to do it 6 or 7 times. And that's an easy and quick win. The more complicated stuff that requires understanding of the conversation, that's coming. And some solution providers would say, yes, it's actually there now. But like I say, again, it's not a big bang thing. It doesn't happen overnight.
Certainly, it's good to hear that AHT is not used, as a performance driver as much now. I mean, we certainly see that in the collections world, but I suppose it does. The reason why I'm interested in it does impact your capacity planning, doesn't it? You have to use it for capacity planning in terms of resourcing, which goes back to the previous slide.
I mentioned before about people like using the phone. This is from a survey that we've done for the past, 6 years? Yeah. For the Customer Experience Decision Makers Guide, this is from. And this looks at, so basically what we do is ask 1,000 customers, we give them a scenario, a high emotion scenario. Maybe they're making a complaint about a wrong item that's been delivered. High urgency, maybe they're picking somebody up from the airport and they need to know if the plane's on time. High complexity, filling in a mortgage application form or a tax thing or something like that. So we give them a scenario so they can imagine it. And then we give them a list of channels and say, what would be your channel of choice? Where would you go to first? And as you can see, pre-pandemic, because this is done in like Q1 each year, so this is just before the pandemic hit, you can see the 2020 figures there. It was the case that phone channel wasn't necessarily chosen by a particularly high number of people. High emotion, a lot of that tends to go by email. It used to be letter, but now email is the new letter, because complaints, especially, it's interesting actually, because in America, they're far happier to pick up the phone and complain. Obviously, the British are terribly polite and don't want to do that. So they just bang out a rude email instead. But for the complexity and the urgency was very much along web self-service. Complexity, a lot of people actually wanted to go and have a sit down and a face-to-face chat with somebody, especially the older generation. So it's a real kind of mix there. But what we saw, we can't prove it's pandemic related, but to be honest, it looks pretty coincidental otherwise. 21-22, we saw a large proportion of people with urgent and complex issues wanting to pick up the phone, even it wasn't necessarily for urgency, it wasn't necessarily the quickest way of doing it, but they wanted to get the job done and they were confident they get the job done on the phone. So that's the urgency side. The complexity side, obviously people locked in houses or when they were let out, a lot of people, well, to be honest, I don't really want to have a face-to-face with somebody. And so you can see that they'd rather pick up the phone, and that would replace the kind of face-to-face channel. So different stories about why urgency and complexity have changed, with the same result as in more pressure on the phone channel. And again, all those have dropped a little bit in 23. It's not, those are unpublished figures at the moment. We're putting that in September. We've done the research on it, and that's, as you can see, the phone is still, people have got used to using the phone again.
It's really interesting, because I would have thought with the pandemic, initially, people didn't have the systems in place to be able to do things automatically. But it would have been quicker to self-serve some of this stuff versus phoning in. But there was almost like a knee-jerk reaction. It's like, I'm going to phone in because it's urgent or there's something unusual to talk about. But that's sustained, right, as well. It's
There
sustained over time.
That, but when you look at the alternatives, so you send out an email during the pandemic, you might as well not have bothered, but you get responses back saying we'll get back to you in 30 working days. What are you going to do? If it's anything remotely important that you need an answer to, you're going to say, hell with that, I'm going to pick up the phone. So we've been training ourselves out of using certain channels in certain situations, because it used to be the case like you get an email back in a day or two and stuff. Oh, that's fine, that'll do. But when you get an auto reply saying we're incredibly busy, I'll get down to it next month sometime maybe, then you start losing your faith in that channel, and this kind of inoculates you against everybody else's channels as well, because you think, frankly, I can't rely on email anymore. I need an answer, so what's my alternative? So it's a lot about the kind of psychology of customers, and some of this is conjecture. The numbers back up that idea.
And I suppose, the resourcing piece is important for email handling as much as it is for call centers as well. Making sure that's done. All this stuff doesn't necessarily just happen magically. It's interesting in terms of the importance of the telephony channel. But I think also we're just sitting on the back of potentially relief around mortgages and due to interest rates, as an example, or energy in the autumn as well. The immediate reaction for customers is going to be, I'm going to pick up the phone to deal with it, as much as any kind of automation that might be in place or you might put in place beforehand. Just psychologically, it looks like the phone's going to still be important. We've got to plan for that.
Very much. And if customers are stressed about something, it's very much the case. I want to talk to somebody and ask them, is that definitely been done? Oh, yes, it's been changed in your record. Oh, okay, that's great. Whereas if you're clicking on buttons on a website, you think, is that really happened? Did they really get it? It's about the reassurance. And that's why I say telephony is still a gold standard for customer service.
Yeah, the high emotion element, and so I know this didn't include the collections process specifically, but I'm surprised that wasn't higher. So if I get upset about something, or if I'm talking about something sensitive, I could understand why you might want to talk with someone, because you're going to have a relationship conversation you tend to have with people, and yet that didn't seem to move during the pandemic. People were stressed about potentially their mortgage situation or the job situation, etc. I mean, it was a stressful time for folks, and yet that didn't seem to go up.
I think this, in some ways, what you say there makes sense. In some ways, though, we are beholden to the strictures of the questionnaire. So when I'm giving them the scenario of a high emotion thing, it's something I bought from a shop, an online store that I really wanted has come and it's in the wrong size. So that's maybe what they've got in their heads into when they're thinking like high emotion. How do I deal with that? And you can deal with that effectively without picking up the phone. So yeah, it's not to say that people with high emotion aren't picking up the phone and sort of jump like that, because I dare say if I used a different scenario, I use the same one each year so we can track the same thing, obviously. But yeah, if I gave them a different scenario, we might well have a different situation, because it's actually really hard to provide scenarios that are high complexity but low urgency and low emotion and stuff like that. We kind of do our best, we stay consistent, and we can track patterns over time like that. But yeah, it doesn't rule out the fact that what you described might well have happened. Briefly mentioned AI before, and there's a very colourful chart here because people violently agree and violently disagree with things. So this has been asked not to the customer base. This was asked to 200 businesses, 200 contact centres in the UK. So we said, what do you reckon about AI then? Will it be used to replace agents? And the large majority, though, or if you look at the net difference, it's very much the case, no, AI will not be used to replace agents. And this is UK people. And it's interesting to see the difference between this and the US. There they are far more about AI replacing agents, or at least they were up until maybe a couple of years ago. But there's been quite a sea change in the US about how AI in the contact center is actually expected to be used. The proportion now that think it's going to replace agents is far lower than it used to be. So maybe that was the kind of story at first. Yeah, the AI is coming to take our jobs, and they've actually seen what the AI solutions on the market do and think, no, that's not actually the case. So what is it being used for? Pretty obviously there, AI will be used to support and augment agents. So the AI will be unimportant to our contact center. Hardly anybody thinks that. So there we are. AI is a given. How's it going to be used? In terms of supporting agents, the first big kind of use of it was about chatbots. which are increasing in kind of their intelligence and capability. But I think, to be honest, the really interesting thing is about AI-enabled agent assistance. Within the call itself, the AI is listening and understanding and providing next best actions based on successful outcomes from similar conversations in the past. It might be bringing up various pieces of information that the customers referred to or the agents referred to within the conversation, so the agent doesn't have to go rooting around all these different applications and databases looking for it. It can listen to the conversation and make sure compliance is being followed as well as you'd expect with the kind of real-time analytics. So those are the ways which people are starting to use this, and I think that's probably in the short to medium term, the most interesting use of AI in the contact center.
It does link up with what we talked about a little bit earlier around people wanting to speak to people and the importance of that human connection. And so the AI piece is not replacing as much as like helping that connection get better.
It's getting faster. It's getting faster. It's getting more accurate. So you're going to increase your first contact resolution. You're going to decrease your call durations.
Yeah.
Happy days for everyone.
Yeah. Yeah. Very interesting. Yeah. Very interesting.
Cool. I mentioned before interactions by channel, and despite the fact it's 60 to 70% of investments going in digital, 60 to 70% of customer contact is actually through live telephony. Obviously, there's been a huge sunk cost in that already, so you make an argument for that. In terms of other channels, email has been bumping along about 15% or so for a number of years. Web chat has increased every year. And in terms of web chat handling, 6 or 7 years ago, pretty much everything was done entirely by an agent typing things in. Now, about half of web chats involve AI in some way. Roughly half of them are completely automated. 25% of web chats approximately are fully automated. Another 25% are, that's where we get the AI assistance. So the AI recommends, this is what I reckon. And the agent reads through and says, yeah, that's fine, or changes it. So they're working together on that.
And you mentioned you have this sort of over time. Is that percentage of live agent telephony, how's that changed over time in terms of percentages?
I said 2007 or whenever it was we started this, it was 90%. Dropped. It's been 65-ish for 6 or 7 years now, to be honest with you. We see the lights of letters, and we used to have fax on there as well. This is how old we are. Yeah, that's obviously dropped off a lot. Social media's never really taken off as much as was predicted. There's a reasonable, some companies are using WhatsApp and Messenger and things like that, but again, it's pretty niche. When you're talking about digital, you're talking about web chat and email.
Yeah. And so it's gradually being chipped away. There's a big push, and then it's like from 97 down to 65-ish. There's a big push, and then it's been chipped away, but it's flattened out a little bit.
It's flat. I'm seeing this in America as well. The figures there are very similar.
And what about the interrelationship between this, which is inbound interactions, and portal or self-serve on the website, which is the other piece? So I imagine people are probably going to that, they're answering some of the questions. So some of the easy questions might actually come out because I can see my account online, so I don't need to phone in for that. But then when I do, then this is a proportion that's out there. What's that kind of relationship look like?
Well, the thing is, we don't track that because it's incredibly difficult to measure. And some companies don't even measure that at all. We took a view on this. It's just like, right, stuff coming into the wider contact center inbound. What does it look like? Rather than how many self-service sessions are there and stuff like that. So it wouldn't be something that I could comment on, unfortunately. There's a wealth of evidence to suggest that telephony is not going nowhere.
And what about omni-channel? I suppose we didn't chat about that. I mean, omni-channel, where people bounce between the different channels as well. That's been a theme that's been discussed about more recently. How do they start to companies looking around how they interact between the different channels?
Yeah, you're probably looking about maybe 1 in 5 companies have actually got omni-channel, and this is what they themselves say, despite the fact that the vast majority of them are multi-channel. So there's a couple of things there that kind of hold this back. There's this kind of silos of data and business processes between the channels when they were set up that they've never really played together nicely. And a lot of that is not just business process, it's also down to the technology platform that doesn't support a single view of the customer. If you have channels working in isolation, without a technology upgrade, a platform upgrade, where the customer can literally be tracked and have a single master data set to follow them around and what they're doing, then you're going to be isolated. The choice really is let things ride as they are and just hope for the best. Replace your technology platform or upgrade your technology platform and get something to everything work together. Or have each of your individual channels so amazing that nobody has to ever change channel. They can always get what they want on the channel that they choose. Yeah, those are your options.
Yeah, so it's about 20% at the moment because the interaction between them is interesting. Definitely look at the cost. And I know in your survey you had some cost analysis around the relative cost of each of the different channels. And surprisingly, telephony was the highest. But obviously, if you can shave off some of the cost of the telephony by starting with a web chat and then going halfway through to an inbound call when it's needed, that can help with cost, I'd imagine.
I wouldn't necessarily say so, to be honest with you. Depends if it's an automated web chat, in which case, yes, it costs pence. But if you've got an agent involved, no, you've got the agent's time there. And then you've still got to, in most cases, take them through ID&V, identity verification and stuff like that. Really, you want to try to be solving the issue on that particular channel, unless there's a really good reason that you don't.
I suppose this is going back to the idea of first contact resolution, isn't it?
Yeah.
So whatever the channel is, then to make sure it's solved then. But what about efficiencies in terms of cost of each of the channels here? Certainly email and web chat at sort of face value is seen as being cheaper versus live agent. But I suppose to your point, if you've got someone sitting behind manually doing the chat, then there's limited efficiencies there to a lesser extent.
We have been tracking this since 2017. So the cost of the phone, as you imagine, has gone up considerably since then because call duration. The web chat, on the other hand, that's the one we've noticed the real difference in. And not particularly unusually or unexpectedly, web chat's dropped as the level of automation has gone up. The cost per web chat's dropped. Who'd have thought it? But it's nice to actually see some sort of evidence there.
Yeah.
Email cost has dropped as well, but it doesn't tend to be used as much. You don't get as many fully automated emails as you do fully automated web chats. So again, I think it's to do with the level of automation that's involved there. I'm not including just the standard response that you get. That doesn't count. I'm talking about ones that actually involve some sort of intelligent response. So yeah, basically we see the more automation and intelligence that's being used, the lower the cost per channel. Yeah. And as this gets used in the phone channel, I would expect to see the same thing there. But it's going to be a few years yet before we can be 100% sure about that, because it's still very early days for AI enablement on an agent desktop.
Yeah. Okay. Super interesting.
Okay. The last chart I've got to talk through here is about the kind of most valued characteristic of the contact center agent. And this feeds into really the rest of what I've been talking about here. I think the importance of the voice channel, which is closely linked to the importance that customers place on being able to talk to somebody to make sure they're heard, to be confident that the business is understood and that it will actually deliver. And this confidence is driven in large cases by empathy. Oh yes, I understand. Yes, we can do that for you, and stuff like this. So there's the rest of the things on there are actually in many ways teachable skills. I think empathy and listening can be improved, but it comes far more naturally, I think, than some of the other harder skills that can be trained.
This one here, it just really emphasizes the fact that humans being on the phone, being humans, is what you need, and it draws up this whole sort of narrative around the fact that it is important. People are going to want to speak to humans to a certain extent, and that's still as important as probably as it's ever been, despite all the discussion that's out there. But it's that human skill, the empathy and the listening skills, which I know that we do training. I'm thinking about vulnerable customers here in collections, or people under financial stress as well. Yeah. That is the skill where you want to almost isolate that within your contact center, because it's that human understanding.
Absolutely. And when people are recruiting agents, some of them do look for these particular soft skills. I said they are, in some cases, they come naturally, but we're seeing now AI being used for things like sentiment analysis within a call, and then flagging instances of stress, or flagging either customer behavior and or agent behavior within the call. So if the agent is monitoring, say they're monitoring their tone, the pace, the empathetic language that they're using, are there any instances of kind of talk over, somebody raising their voice, can you hear stress patterns in the voice and things like that, and then have little cues on the screen for the agent, just like shut up a minute and listen, or you're doing this, and then the AI is able to look at instances before where similar situations have happened and where did the positive outcomes come from and how did they get there, and then suggest those. So it's like in-call coaching, in theory far more effective than having somebody sat next to you, because you can't have your supervisor who knows everything sat next to every single agent in the contact center. But the AI does give the promise of having the supervisor on your screen.
Yeah, and I did hear one use of AI, which was also interesting, which is around the training side of things as well, which is, so if you analyze all of the calls and you're looking to try and get to an outcome, let's say it's sales, be it identifying a vulnerability or putting people on a payment plan, etc. And if you identify all of the good calls and all of the calls, and you have those that are good, which were the ones that, what techniques were used to get there the quickest and the most efficiently, and then almost like wrapping that up into a training program to say, look, based off the calls I've heard, this is where you can improve. And it's almost like shortcutting the training cycle, almost like from side-by-side training being like 6 months down to 2 or 3 months, that's a big deal in terms of new starters, better skills, lower AHT, those kind of things. I mean,
Absolutely.
becoming
But
the
I
future.
think certainly for teaching people in the first place, this is how you get positive outcomes. That's great. There's evidence to show that a better way of doing it is to do that and then have real-time analytics on the screen, making sure that those things are followed, because people will retrench back to their previous position before, because that's just our personality is who we are. So people need kind of reminders about, oh, do this, don't do that.
Well, like
Especially when you
coaching
especially when you're caught up in a call and things like that, and maybe you're not actually thinking about kind of communication style or am I listening clearly or things like that.
Yeah.
So,
well, I could do with the big flashing light that's in the corner saying, "Stop talking, Chris." These things, I think that would be very helpful.
Absolutely.
In many aspects of life, I think. So, okay, Steve, I think it's fascinating, right? I know that I saw this data and I saw the data earlier on, just in terms of it was a bit of an aha moment in terms of actually the data saying something else different to what we're necessarily hearing. And I thought it's super interesting, and it was a bit of a sit-up moment for me, at least anyway. So that's why I picked up the phone.
We do a lot of reports on kind of technology and business processes within contact centers. And this is something I was really keen to do for a number of years, because we often interview businesses and it's great to get businesses' views, but I really wanted to hear stuff from the consumer. And there's some stuff in there that's actually pretty counterintuitive. For example, one of the questions was, which of these particular attributes of a contact center do you most value? Things like first contact resolution, long opening hours, this type of thing. One of them is polite and friendly agents. And in fact, it was the youngest year group that really rated that the highest. And you kind of think, why would that be? Because surely everybody knows older people are like politeness, younger people just want to be doing things really quickly and get on with it. But in fact, younger people have got so much less experience about speaking with people on the phone generally, and in particular with businesses, that they're actually quite nervous about it. So having a nice agent who listens to them and explains things and calms them down almost in some ways is actually viewed as really positive by these guys, which, to be honest, I wouldn't have thought of unless we'd actually gone out and done that data and okay, that's maybe counterintuitive, but yeah, I can see why that is. And actually having a few teenagers myself, I can totally see that, because they hate picking up the phone.
Yeah, it's interesting. I just find it's fascinating going back to original data, seeing data, and particularly when it's counterintuitive. I say it's super interesting. I know you've got that on the screen just in terms of where people can go more information. I do encourage people to go and have a look, because there's a whole suite of different reports out there for the US, for the UK and the US as well. I think you do it for both, right? So yeah, well, Steve, thanks very much for making the time. I really appreciate you taking me through the report. As I say, I do encourage people to go and have a look, but really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.